In this episode, we are moving into a part of vulnerability analysis that seems simple at first because it gives people a number, but that number only becomes useful when you understand what it can tell you and what it cannot. The Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS, exists to help security teams describe the technical severity of vulnerabilities in a more consistent way, which is extremely helpful when an organization is facing hundreds or thousands of findings across many different systems. For a brand new learner, the easiest way to think about CVSS is that it provides a shared measuring stick for how serious a vulnerability appears from a technical standpoint. That shared measuring stick matters because defenders need a common language when they talk to engineers, managers, auditors, and other analysts who all need to understand the problem quickly. At the same time, a score is not the same thing as a full risk decision, and much of the confusion around vulnerability management begins when people treat those two ideas as if they were identical. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Vulnerability scoring exists because modern environments produce far more security findings than any team can handle through instinct alone. If every missing patch, exposed service, configuration weakness, and application flaw arrived without some kind of structured severity language, organizations would struggle to explain urgency or compare one issue to another in a meaningful way. CVSS helps solve part of that problem by giving security teams a standardized method for describing how severe a vulnerability is based on its technical characteristics rather than on personal opinion. This creates more consistency across reports, vendors, internal teams, and assessment tools, which makes security conversations much easier to manage. Instead of saying one flaw feels dangerous while another seems less worrying, the team can refer to a scoring model that applies defined logic to the vulnerability. That kind of consistency does not eliminate judgment, but it does reduce confusion and make the first stage of prioritization much more disciplined than it would be otherwise. At its core, CVSS is trying to answer a narrow but important question. If this vulnerability exists, how severe does it appear to be based on the way it can be exploited and the damage it could cause to the affected system or data? That focus is very useful because it gives analysts a common starting point for technical comparison across different kinds of weaknesses. It also helps explain why CVSS is not a complete risk model for the organization as a whole. The scoring system is mostly concerned with the vulnerability itself and the general conditions surrounding its exploitation, not with the specific business importance of the asset in your environment. In other words, CVSS is describing the technical seriousness of the weakness, not automatically telling you how much your particular organization should panic about it. Once beginners understand that boundary, the rest of the topic becomes much easier because they stop expecting the score to answer questions it was never designed to answer by itself. One of the most familiar parts of CVSS is the numeric score, which usually falls on a scale from 0 to 10. That number helps make the output feel straightforward, because people naturally assume higher numbers mean more urgent and more dangerous findings. In a basic sense, that assumption is correct, since a higher score usually reflects a vulnerability that is easier to exploit, more damaging when exploited, or both. Organizations and tools often group those numbers into severity bands such as low, medium, high, and critical, so that large lists of findings can be sorted and discussed more quickly. This makes dashboards and reports easier to read, especially when an analyst is trying to identify which items deserve earlier attention. Even so, the convenience of a number can also become a trap because people sometimes start acting as though a score of 9 always matters more than a score of 6 in every situation, when real environments are rarely that simple. To understand why the number is useful, you have to understand that CVSS is built from several characteristics of the vulnerability rather than from arbitrary guesswork. Part of the score reflects impact, which means the amount of harm the weakness could cause if it were exploited successfully. When analysts talk about impact in this context, they are often thinking about whether the vulnerability could expose sensitive information, allow unauthorized changes, or disrupt the availability of a system or service. A flaw that could give an attacker broad access to confidential data or the ability to alter important records will generally be seen as more severe than a flaw with only minor effect on one low-value function. This is helpful because it keeps the score tied to consequence rather than only to the presence of a technical bug. For a beginner, this matters because a vulnerability is not serious merely because it exists. It becomes serious because of what it could let an attacker do to the things the system is supposed to protect. Another major part of the score relates to exploitability, which is essentially about how reachable and usable the weakness appears to be from an attacker's perspective. A vulnerability that can be exploited remotely across a network is often more serious than one that requires local access to the system first. A vulnerability that needs no special privileges and no help from a user is often more serious than one that requires an already elevated account or a victim to click something at exactly the wrong moment. A vulnerability that is simple to trigger under ordinary conditions is often more serious than one that depends on unusual timing or fragile circumstances that are hard to reproduce. CVSS tries to account for these kinds of differences because they strongly influence how practical a weakness may be in real life. This part of the score is especially useful because it reminds analysts that severity is shaped not only by damage, but also by how easy it may be for an attacker to reach the point where that damage becomes possible. Once you combine impact and exploitability, the score becomes a structured way of expressing technical severity, but that does not mean it becomes the final answer to everything. One of the most important professional lessons for a new analyst is that severity and risk are related but not identical. A vulnerability may have a very high CVSS score because it is dangerous in general, yet the immediate business risk in your environment may be lower if the affected system is isolated, closely monitored, or protected by compensating controls. On the other hand, a vulnerability with a moderate score may become extremely important if it sits on a public-facing identity service, a payment system, or a platform that supports critical operations. This difference is why strong analysts do not simply read the number and stop thinking. They use the score as a starting point, then add environmental awareness, asset value, exposure, and operational consequence to decide what should actually happen next. Imagine two systems affected by the same vulnerability and therefore sharing the same CVSS score. One is an internet-facing server that supports customer logins and processes sensitive data every hour of the day. The other is a lab machine used occasionally for testing, isolated from production, and accessible only to a small internal team. The technical severity of the vulnerability might be identical on paper because the weakness itself behaves the same way in both cases. The practical urgency, however, is clearly different because the first system sits much closer to the business, much closer to attackers, and much closer to visible damage if something goes wrong. This is one of the clearest examples of why CVSS is helpful but incomplete. It gives both findings a common technical description, yet the analyst still has to decide which one demands faster action based on the environment in which the weakness actually lives. This is also why experienced teams often combine CVSS with other kinds of information before setting remediation priorities. They may consider whether the asset is exposed to the internet, whether it supports a critical business process, whether exploits are actively circulating in the real world, whether detection controls are strong, and whether the affected system contains data or privileges that would make compromise especially costly. None of that replaces CVSS, because the score is still useful for describing the technical seriousness of the flaw itself. What those additional factors do is turn severity into operational decision-making. That step matters because organizations do not patch systems in a mathematical vacuum. They patch systems in environments full of uptime concerns, limited staff, business pressure, and uneven asset importance, which means the same technical score can lead to different response decisions when the context changes. A related misunderstanding is the belief that lower-scored vulnerabilities can be ignored safely. In real environments, that is often a dangerous assumption because attackers do not always need one dramatic critical weakness if several smaller weaknesses can be combined or used opportunistically over time. A medium-severity issue on a lightly defended system may still be very useful to an attacker if it helps with reconnaissance, privilege expansion, data collection, or movement to a more valuable target. Even low-severity issues can matter when they reflect a pattern of poor maintenance, unmanaged drift, or weak controls across many systems. This does not mean every minor finding deserves the same emergency response as the most severe issues. It means the score should guide attention, not replace judgment. A strong analyst looks not only at individual numbers, but also at clusters, repetition, exposure patterns, and the possibility that several seemingly ordinary weaknesses together may create a much more serious problem than any one of them would suggest alone. The reverse misunderstanding happens too, and it is just as important for beginners to avoid. A critical score does not automatically mean instant catastrophe in every environment, nor does it mean that validation and analysis can be skipped. Sometimes a high score reflects a genuinely dangerous weakness that deserves immediate attention, but sometimes the finding still needs confirmation because scanner logic may be incomplete, the service may not be exposed the way the report assumes, or operational controls may reduce practical exploitability significantly. Analysts should respond seriously to high-scoring issues, but serious response includes verification, context gathering, and communication, not just panic. This is one reason mature teams avoid making remediation decisions from the severity label alone. They know that the label helps focus attention, yet they also know that wasted effort on misunderstood findings can erode trust and distract the team from issues that are both severe and truly relevant to the environment. CVSS is also useful because it helps different parts of the organization communicate more clearly. Security teams need a way to explain vulnerability severity in terms that are consistent across scans, assessments, vendors, and reporting cycles. Engineers need a way to understand why one item is being escalated while another can wait for a planned maintenance window. Managers need a way to see whether the organization is reducing the number of highly severe findings over time or allowing them to accumulate. The score helps support those conversations because it gives everyone a shared reference point, even if they do not all think about security in the same way. That shared reference point becomes especially valuable in large environments where many different teams own different systems. Without some form of common scoring language, vulnerability management can become a series of disconnected arguments instead of a coordinated process grounded in repeatable logic. It is worth understanding that CVSS is a tool for structured judgment, not a substitute for thinking. The scoring model is useful precisely because it standardizes part of the conversation, but every model leaves some things out, and those missing pieces still matter in daily security work. Business function, asset criticality, data sensitivity, external exposure, exploit activity, and compensating controls all influence what the organization should do next, even when the technical score is already known. This is why mature analysts learn to speak in two layers at once. They can explain the technical severity of the vulnerability using CVSS, and they can also explain the business significance of the finding using the organization's own environment and priorities. That combination is powerful because it keeps the team from oversimplifying the problem. It preserves the value of standardized scoring while still making room for the real-world judgment that turns raw findings into smart decisions. Another useful perspective for a new learner is that CVSS helps create order, but order is not the same thing as certainty. A score can make a large report easier to sort, easier to trend over time, and easier to present to leadership. Yet the presence of a neat number does not magically remove ambiguity from the underlying security situation. The environment may still be changing, the scan may still contain false positives, the business impact may still be unclear, and the vulnerability may still interact with other weaknesses in ways the score alone does not capture. Recognizing this keeps analysts honest and careful. It also helps them communicate more responsibly, because they can say that a flaw is technically severe without pretending that the number alone defines every aspect of the risk. In practice, that honesty makes vulnerability programs better, since the team becomes less dependent on rigid numeric thinking and more capable of blending structured scoring with thoughtful interpretation. The big takeaway is that CVSS gives security teams a standardized way to describe the technical severity of vulnerabilities, which makes comparison, communication, and early prioritization much easier in large and complicated environments. It does this by considering factors related to exploitability and impact, then translating that logic into a number and severity band that people across the organization can understand more quickly. That is extremely valuable, but it is only part of the larger task of vulnerability management because technical severity is not the same thing as full business risk. Strong analysts use CVSS as a starting point, then add environmental context, asset importance, exposure, and practical consequence before deciding what deserves the fastest or most serious response. Once you understand that balance, the scoring system becomes much more useful and much less mysterious. It stops being just a number in a report and becomes what it was always meant to be, a disciplined piece of the decision-making process, not the entire decision by itself.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.